Thanks, Jeremy. Good morning. The creature you see in front of you is an Irish elk. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it now and then come back to it later in the talk. But an Irish elk is a prime example of runaway sexual selection. And that means that the female elk preferred the male elk with the larger horns. And the male elk with the larger horns, though he didn't necessarily use them for combat, impressed the smaller male elk and made them afraid to mate with the females. This happened over millions of generations until the horns were 12 feet across. What happened 23,000 years ago in Ireland was they went extinct. The climate changed, and they weren't able to get enough calcium and phosphorus because of the new foraging materials, and it leached out of their skeleton, and they died out. So this is an example of how a historical environment can impact a species. Today I'm going to talk about both supply and demand on a full and growing planet, and how looking at history of where we came from can be very important in looking where we're going. I'm going to talk about briefly about supply because Lord Ron Oxburgh and some others have talked about this already, and I'm going to spend most of my talk on demand. I'm probably going to raise many more questions than I have answers, but sometimes I think it's important to focus on the right questions because we spend a lot of time on trying to nail down the date of peak oil, and maybe that's not the most important question. This graph I will return to several times. It's a little bit complicated. It shows a history of life on the planet and the geological record. Basically, this little sliver here is in the 20 million years of apes and hominids, and then the sliver here is made up of the 12,000 years below. So since we split off from apes 5 million years ago, that would be 400 of the bottom graph. You can see the rise of human population was very minor for millions of years until several hundred years ago when we found the energy lottery in coal and subsequently fossil fuels. The dots on the graph on the far right, 3 of those represent 1 human generation. So in the brief span of a few human generations, the population has exploded. We've gone through energy transitions from fire to coal, then to oil and gas, and I'm going to briefly talk about that. This is an energy composition of the United States in percentage of energy over the last 200 years. And very quickly we went from wood and animate converters, which we needed to feed, to coal and then to oil, gas, and electricity. You can notice that as oil and gas have declined a little bit, coal and electricity have been going up. Renewable energy does not necessarily connote equatability. You can't just say something is renewable and automatically have it possess the same properties as a fossil fuel. I'm going to speak to several of those issues. One is the spatial, temporal, and geographical dispersion of renewable energy. As you can see in this graph, the central of Africa gets very little solar radiation compared to the south and the north. Similar patterns occur with wind. There's intermittency issues, etc. So that's something that we have to consider. This graph shows the different power densities. On the left of the graph, it's the watts per meter squared, and on the bottom is the amount of area. Now, what we've got is a disconnect between our infrastructure and the fuels that we're using. The hydrocarbon fields are 100 to 1,000 watts per meter squared, where biomass has about 1 watt per meter squared. So what that really means is if we're to replace our energy-dense infrastructure with something like biomass, we're going to need to use a heck of a lot more land. And that, again, echoes something that Lord Ron Oxburgh said this morning. You see the high-rise buildings, we would need 1,000 times their surface area covered in solar photovoltaics in order to replace that energy that is in fossil fuels. I heard an interesting example last night that in Germany They actually have new laws that limit the amount of power density that a new building can be. So in effect, we have to either come up with better alternatives, the bottom pieces, or reduce our infrastructure in power density. Energy density is also something that was discussed previously. I'll just point out here that our prior two energy transitions went from wood to coal, which is an increase in energy density, the amount of energy per unit volume or mass. And then the next transition was from coal to gasoline. And unless we go nuclear, the next energy transition is likely to be downward. I've written several papers on this topic in the last few years, and I think it's very important, but not for reasons that we usually expect. This entire curve of all the colors together is the total energy of some resource, oil or whatever, the gross resource. But there are costs in getting the gross resource. D, the black strip, is the direct cost. In the case of oil, it would be the amount of oil and gas needed to pull it out of the ground physically, and the fuel that the helicopters need to go to bring people to the platforms. There's also indirect costs, like the cost needed to build the helicopter, to build the copper wires that are going to the plant and to the refiner. Depending on how wide a boundary you draw, you could also include the roads or the hospitals that support the workers. I mean, some energy needs to be required in order to get energy. And then if you're being truly holistic and wide boundary, you have to include the environmental externalities and wide boundaries, which would be the B. So the gross curve is X, but A is all that's really left over for society. And why this is important is we need energy in order to do economic work. Without energy, we can't do work. And if the energy sector itself is using an increasing amount of energy, that's less available for hospitals, infrastructure, Disneyland, etc. This was, it's a little dated graph. I'm sorry that it's blurry, but this is the actual energy profit ratio, which is similar to net energy, of Louisiana onshore oil and gas. And early on in its production profile, there was a slow but increasing energy profit. It peaked at around 37 to 1. And when this graph was complete, it was about 5 or 6 to 1. Anecdotal evidence I've heard is it's close to energy break-even now. The energy inputs into getting a barrel of oil out of Louisiana are roughly matched by what you get out. So we've all seen this graph or some version of it, but in reality, it's going to look something like this. Sorry for that pop. We don't have great data on this. Charlie Hall is working on trying to extrapolate a world number. What we do know is that in the 1930s in the United States, we got 100 barrels of oil out for 1 barrel of energy that we put in. It was a 100 to 1 profit ratio. In 1970, it was 30 to 1. In 2000, it was between 10 and 17 to 1. And again, anecdotally now, it's much lower than that. So to me, I think Jeff Rubin mentioned yesterday that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are using a lot more internal consumption. I don't think that a 50% rise in internal consumption over 7 years can be explained by vehicle miles traveled. I think a big part of that is they're using more oil and gas for their own, expanding infrastructure, trying to increase production. But again, things are reported in dollars, and it's very difficult to get information in energy terms. Two colleagues and I just completed a paper on water. Water is as embedded in human society as energy, and it's also a constraint. The paper was Energy Return on Water Invested, and it basically showed that biofuels require between 80 and 1,000 times as much water per unit as conventional fossil fuels. Now, granted, solar and wind don't require any water, at least directly in their process, but a lot of alternative energies do. This graph just basically a look at the bottom part, and the countries shaded in black, according to the United Nations water needs in 2025, will have zero ability to expand energy production using bioenergy because of water shortages. Note China on there. The United States will have some limitations, but not dramatic ones. Coal to liquids has already been discussed. Just briefly, coal to liquids is 400% the greenhouse gas that regular oil is. And the other thing we have to consider when looking at alternative supply is that we're only one of millions of species on the planet, and already we use between 20 and 50% of the net primary productivity via photosynthesis that's hitting the planet for human consumption. So we have to remember that actually part of our enjoyment of life is that we share the planet with other creatures. Briefly again, the summary I just said, we have to pay attention to energy quality because all BTUs are not equal in their impact on society. Energy quantity is important. We should be caring a lot more about the net. These projections that show natural gas liquids and ethanol in total liquids, natural gas liquids only have 60% of the BTUs as oil, and also some of these things like ethanol take almost as much oil as they throw off, but yet they're included in the gross figures. And finally, we have to look at non-energy inputs, especially water, and as the three prior speakers talked about, greenhouse gases. Okay, now on to the fun and what I think more interesting things. In order to know where we're headed, we have to know where we've come from. And human behavior can only properly be viewed as a product of natural selection. This is not a radical pronunciation anymore. This has been completely proven in the last few years by cognitive neuroscience and other fields, and they're essentially completely disproven the rational actor model of neoclassical economics. Our so-called rational mind is simply not have that much control over the rest of our mind and our bodies, and I'm going to talk about that for the rest of my talk. Yesterday's honest and wise speaker a long time ago said that we only have two modes when it comes to energy: complacency and panic. I'm going to explain the evolutionary origins of that comment. Our current president has also said America is addicted to oil. I think what he meant was that we're addicted to the energy services that oil provides, and I'm going to talk about that as well. Next spring, I'm organizing a conference in California that's going to be a lateral thinking conference. It's trying to get a lot of different, there's too many academic disciplines right now, and they're so splintered, and we need to start talking to each other more because there's just not enough time and there's too much going on. Now, when I give this speech to undergraduates, I usually lunge at the front row to give this impact, but the former director of the CIA is there, so I figured I'd err on the safe side. But if you were paying attention to this, maybe you know that you're in this warm room and you just had some coffee and everything is safe, but you might have had a physical reaction of some norepinephrine or your fight or flight impulse. That has nothing to do with what I'm saying or what your conscious mind is thinking. It's a physical response. We share systems that have evolved for millions and millions of years within us that are part of us. If you look at the first human life was about 3 billion years ago, the brain since then has never slept. It's added on pieces and pieces. The first brain was something that moved away from a stimulus or moved towards the light. And basically reptiles and dinosaurs. 65 million years ago, there was a meteor, the Chicxulub meteor, wiped out 90% of the Earth mammals at that point, and we've all come from that point. But the reptilian brain was built on top of the primitive, the simple brain, and the mammalian brain, which is also called the limbic system or emotional system, was built on top of that. Many millions of generations. Even at 20 years per human generation, since we split off from apes, that's 250,000 generations where our neocortex, or our new mammalian brain, expanded. And it expanded because, the brain is a physical system. It functions as a computer, and it was designed to solve the problems of what our ancestral environment was, which is very different than the problems of today. So if you look in the lower right, that is the different regions of our brain: the reptilian brain, as I was saying, the limbic system, and then the neocortex, which separates us from the lower animals. It's important to point out that Homo sapiens evolved amidst scarcity. The gentleman that gave me this graph is actually on my thesis committee. He wrote a book called American Mania, and he runs UCLA's Neuroscience Institute. So if we talk about, this is ASPO6, and there were things in the 70s that people talked about. Unless we have a smoking gun like DDT or unleaded gas or chlorofluorocarbons, something like that. We need a smoking gun. Otherwise, we don't react until there is a critical stimulus. If you think about it, for millions of years of evolution, why would there have been a selection pressure for something to defer consumption? If a cheetah or one of a previous hominids decided, no, I think I'll kill that animal next week, he would have been outcompeted by, you know, his peer group. So we have a deep history of favoring the present over the future. And frankly, the only reasons that humans don't completely favor the present over the future is because we have built infrastructure. We have sunk costs in our built capital. And this can be measured by something called the discount rate. Everyone think for a moment, would you prefer a 15-minute massage right now or a 20-minute massage 2 hours from now? Well, or would you prefer a 15-minute massage for free in a week or a 20-minute massage in a week in 2 hours? Neuroeconomists and psychologists call this a small short-term reward versus a large long-term reward. Most of us would just say, well, 15 minutes right now, I'll take it right now. I don't want to wait 2 hours for an extra 5 minutes. But next week, I'll arrange my schedule so that I'll get the extra 5 minutes. So we can actually measure these decisions by what's called a discount rate. A discount rate is used in finance, but it also can be used in economics, where a discount rate of 1 means we value the present completely. A discount rate of 0 means we value something in 2050 the same as we do today. So something very fascinating has been working on the last few years, where people have discovered via brain scans and neuroeconomics that our two areas of brains that I talked about before, the neomammalian limbic system and our rational human thinking system, discount the future at completely different rates. When we make emotional decisions, we highly value the present over the future. And the rational brain is when we're figuring out mortgage payments or Hubbard linearization is more precise, but our emotional brains are focused on the present. So it ends up leading into a dynamic inconsistency. A lot of us have probably had these promises where we know that we need to do something, and we decide today to do it, but we decide to do it in the future. But very quickly, tomorrow becomes today, and our plans are hijacked. The prior graph, I forgot to mention, the neuroeconomists call quasi-hyperbolic discount rates. So basically, our rational minds, we plan to make the right choice, but our emotional brains are stronger. This might also explain why Richard invited me to this conference in May, and I intended all summer to do a great presentation, and I finished it at an internet cafe yesterday in Cork. And this is speculation, but it may explain why the futures markets are not in 2014, 2015 showing $200, $300 oil, because fund managers and everyone are just care about the current trend. What's going on right now? I got my bonus this quarter. I got my bonus this year. Yeah, I believe your peak oil might have higher prices. I'll jump on board when that happens. So not only are humans in general have steep discount rates, but some groups of humans have even steeper discount rates. Smokers, drinkers, drug users, high-risk takers, stressed people. One of the most interesting studies recently was a test between men and women. Men were shown a pretty face versus an average face, two control groups, and then asked to do a small short-term reward or a larger long-term reward. And women did the same test. Men were completely emotionally triggered after seeing an attractive face, and they chose the smaller short-term reward in a vast majority compared to women, where women made the correct financial decision in the vast majority. It's funny, but it's actually very important. It suggests that women probably ought to have a larger role in our political body. So again, this is a discount rate. The market discount rate is mathematical and precise. Moderate human discount rate, and then an addict's rate. Of course, an addict is defined as someone who has a recurring compulsion to engage in some specific activity. So the good news is that these steep discount rates act as kind of an analgesic. Because even though all of us in this room understand the problems of peak oil, you know, it's still some time away before the proverbial substance hits the fan. So we can live today and have good food and sex and laughter and good times. And so that's the good news. The bad news is that it ultimately will lead in panic once the situation actually hits us. This has happened time and time again, and if you notice the prior graph, now is when we can use our rational brains. When we're in a panic situation, we're going to revert to those primitive and emotional impulses in a lot of ways. So that's a double reason to take action now on peak oil. So this graph indicates how we can be tricked by our environment. Again, the vast majority of our evolution was on the Pleistocene, where we were hunter-gatherers and salty and sweet foods were in short supply. Well, now they're in every convenience store and everywhere, and our rational brains are not strong enough, in most cases, to resist these impulses. So the survival instinct of our brain drives self-interest and exploration for risk and is essential for self-gain. Novelty stimulates curiosity, but we quickly become bored with the familiar. So the dopaminergic superhighways, and I'm not going to get into the names, are essential for both functions. This is an amazing example that I think actually has a lot of implications for the issues we're talking about. It's long been known that dopamine neurons of the limbic system are critical for reinforcing certain kinds of behavior. Schultz was the first to test the activity of these neurons as thirsty monkeys sat quietly and listened for a tone, which was followed by a squirt of fruit juice into their mouths. After a period of fixed, steady amount of juice, the amount of juice was doubled without warning. The rate of dopamine neuron firing in the monkeys went from 3 to 80 a second. But as this new magnitude of rewards was repeated, the firing rate gradually returned to the baseline of 3 firings per second. The opposite happened when the reward was reduced without warning. The firing rate of dopamine dropped dramatically. We know that this is habituation. We very quickly get used to new novel stimuli. And this was 2 months ago, and we can see how these things can lead to addiction. We've got, as I said before, we're not really addicted to oil, but we're addicted to some of the energy services it provides. Shoppers, for example, you get the most pleasure at the moment you decide to buy that pair of shoes. And after that, there's a slow decay until 2 or 3 weeks after. It's, oh, these shoes, I've worn them already, no big deal. Sex, it's not that big of a leap for someone, a man, to see a picture of a woman in a bikini, and 5 years later he's a subscriber to pygmetransvestiteorgy.com or something like that. We easily get hijacked by things that our brain doesn't know are bad for us. Just this morning I read about a man in China who played a video game on a computer for 48 hours and he died. So that can happen. 19 million addicted to alcohol, illegal drugs, nicotine. 80 to 90% of adults routinely ingest caffeine. Caffeine steepens our discount rates. When we have caffeine in our system, we're more likely to make a short-term response. Why is that legal? I don't know. Note that the USA only has 300 million people, so certainly some of these have been double counted. So dopamine is a wanting drug. It doesn't make us feel like we're satisfied. We cannot get enough. As soon as you have some, you want more. Classic story, this is a brain scan of a normal person and someone with Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's is one area of the brain that does not have enough dopamine. And so there's a drug called Mirapex where they give to the Parkinson's patients. Well, dozens of Parkinson's patients in the last 2 years have checked into the Mayo Clinic with bizarre behavioral problems. They have a church pastor had 6 extramarital affairs. A guy who'd never gambled in his life lost $100,000 at an Indian casino. So too much dopamine actually caused these people to have behavior in other areas of their brain. You know, it's not just simple as one chemical, but it's a big deal. And as you can see, this is the day after Thanksgiving, and shopping begins to look like an addiction. So in the broad picture of things, a long time ago, we didn't have as much access to novelty. We would have a great meal, and that would be like our stimulation, and then we go with our work for the day. More recently, a visit from a singer or a traveling bard or a relative might have given us that boost. But now we've got so much novelty. Disneyland, Irish dancers, rave clubs, etc. There's just so much that our unexpected rewards, keep increasing. So a couple points I want to make. This novelty, think of a volume knob on your stereo. If you listen to music at a 2 and you turn it up to an 8 for a week, you can't really go back to a 2 again. It's not the same. So it's just kind of a one-way track. And we've won the energy lottery in a broad sense as a species. But if you look at research, psychological research on lottery winners, they have 10 times the suicide rate as non-lottery winners, huge depression rates. Lottery winners get a quick burst of happiness, but then they quickly recede. So I think another thing to point out here is that Parkinson's is not enough dopamine. Schizophrenia is too much dopamine. And you could eventually see, if we get more energy supply, that everyone in society just becomes schizophrenic. I'm sorry, I wasn't supposed to tell you that. It was speculation. Moving on to the last part of the evolutionary origins of our behavior. All of us in the room, are selected from the best of the best at acquiring resources and getting those resources to our offspring. The last few hundred years don't change the mental wiring in our system. One of the more famous, one of the most fertile men in history is actually from Ireland, Neil of the 9 hostages. There are about 7 million men in Ireland and the eastern United States that share his specific Y haploid chromosome. But there's been evolutionary psychology research on what men and women prefer, and it's different. Men prefer youth, beauty, fidelity in women. Women prefer resources, maturity, the intent to provide those resources, and good genes. These were in the top 10. Now, interestingly, I must say that the number one trait desired by both male and female is kindness. But another thing I should point out is that there's a war of escalation between the sexual selection of men and women. Men have to invest 15 minutes in an offspring, and women invest a year. So over a long period of time, that's happened in a war of escalation between the BSers and the BS detectors. And that is a core behavioral driver in our species and in many. So where does this lead us? We're born with some short and some long genetic leashes. And when we wake up and we see the environment that we live in, that's the cue that tells us whether we should try and compete for a large yacht or a small dinghy. And what our culture promotes is that prior yacht was 380 feet long. It was the largest yacht ever made a few years ago, and now there's a new one being built for 545 feet. So what happens is all these people in China see the United States, and that's what they aspire to be. As the wealthy countries, to understand all this, we need to have a different model, especially with what I'm about to show you now. This is an economist at USC did this, something called the hedonic treadmill. It was a cohort study done over 20 years. At the beginning, you were to list the 10 items that you most desired in life and how many you had. And some of the responses were a Mercedes-Benz, a private airplane, a speedboat, etc. And it showed how many you actually had versus how many you desired. And the interesting thing is in the top graph, at the beginning of the 18-year period, they had 2.5 of these 10 things, and they desired 4.3. At the end, they had accumulated some. They got up to 3.2. But their desires increased faster than their possessions. That was the middle-aged people. The older-aged people, same thing. They desired a lot, they got some, and then they desired more at the end of the period. So this is called hedonic adaptation. all kind of interlinked with the prior things I was saying. The same study showed that we do get more happiness from more social interaction, more relationships, deeper relationships, that improved over time, and that did make us happy. Now, this is a fascinating graph. This showed different survey of people every year on, Jeremy, how much time do I have? All right. Each year it was asked, how much money do you make? How much would you say you needed? And no matter how much you made, you said you needed more. As Jeremy said, I used to work on Wall Street, and my first job was I was a high net worth broker. We could not call on anyone unless they had $50 million. And I dealt with billionaires at a young age. I was 25. And I had clients that had $100 million, and they said, all I want is $200 million. I'm going to buy an island, and I'm going to retire. And sure enough, 5 years later, they had $500 million because the guys they were trying to keep up with, the Joneses, their neighbors, had more. So it's not about absolute. It's about relative. And that goes back to our evolutionary origins. So what if the Irish elk could have planned ahead? It didn't need those horns. So we can't change our drive to want more, but we can change how we define more. And I think that is going to be one of the central questions that face this community and the climate change community going forward. This is a graph I did about 18 months ago, so the data may have changed, but on the bottom axis is primary energy use per capita, and on the left axis is the percent subjective well-being that are very happy. The United States, on the right, uses more than double the energy as Ireland, yet both are roughly the same amount of happiness. Further on the scale is the Philippines. The United States uses 38 times the energy as the Philippines, yet roughly the same happiness. All this stuff doesn't make us happier. So, in summary of the second part, we're conditioned via our ancestors and through culture to steeply value the present over the future. I've got writings on that on the internet if you want more details on the papers that back that up. Our behaviors, some innate and some learned, are intrinsically based on the pursuit of those brain chemicals that historically met with success. When I casually look at a beautiful woman, or I win a hand of poker or get a raise, I don't think, ooh, yeah, I'm going to have more babies. I just think, oh, that felt good. So the things that feel good felt good to our ancestors. That's the ultimate genetic process, is to make things feel good so that we do them. Our evolutionary brain scaffolding gets hijacked by novelty items that are plentiful in the oil age. And when they become less plentiful, that's also going to have implications. And finally, the older the brain part, the more potential it has to dominate and override our behavior. So, what are the resources we should be competing for? And I think that the oil constraints that we have are going to suggest very disparate success in various regions of the country, of the world, and different regions are going to have different successes based on what they value. And financial capital could be supplanted by a combination of built capital, like windmills, natural capital, social capital, and human capital, knowledge. So, for a moment, forget about peak oil and climate change. If you understand and internalize this, and especially many of you that have been in business, I'm almost certain that you understand that this is true. We should be making decisions not to save the planet, but for yourself. If you each make decisions for yourself to plot a course of the rest of your life that you and your family and your friends can be happy, everything else falls into place. Why not begin here? Thanks.